We are grateful to be here this morning and thankful for the time that we have to share together in this way, to spend in worship and to spend in considering for a moment in time a short portion of the Word that God has given to us. We've been looking about once a month for a while now at the book of Acts. And in your Bibles, you can be turning to Acts 21. We read from the Sermon on the Mount there in Matthew 5, and I'll hopefully elucidate that connection as we progress this morning. But our sermon is actually going to be taken from Acts 21, where we see in the second half of this chapter a scene erupting that isn't a surprise to the reader at this point. Paul is going to be seized by a mob at first, a Jewish mob on the steps of the temple, and will then ultimately be taken into Roman custody. But Luke has been preparing us for Paul's arrest in the same way that the Holy Spirit warned the apostle throughout his return trip / farewell tour that he had been making all the way since at least chapter 20, really going back a little bit into chapter 19. But in verse 33, where Paul is seized, as some translations read, or taken by the Roman officer there. He's bound with 2 chains, taken into Roman custody, and will not be a free man for the remainder of the book. For the following 8 chapters, he will remain a prisoner of Rome for the entirety of the time that Luke and we spend with the apostle. We would consider this, in a way, the beginning of the end. It was certainly the beginning of a lengthy period of special hardship for Paul. But I'm reminded of how Paul speaks of it later. When he's writing to the saints in Philippi, chapter 1 and verse 12, from imprisonment, from Roman confinement, he says to them, "I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me," and I believe he's talking there about the ordeal that has its origin, has its beginning point here in Acts 21. "The things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel." They've actually turned out for good. In Paul's book, that's a good thing, a more important thing. So whatever he has had to suffer, it is worth it if the gospel of Christ has sounded forth with a wider reach, with louder thunder. If it has succeeded, then he has succeeded as a result. This paradox, which it feels much like a paradox to me, that this suffering, this years of toil and imprisonment and uncertainty and hardship and shipwrecks and beatings and all sorts of things that he is about to face, he can say, but actually, it was good. That put the Beatitudes in my mind. You might already have known, and as we read just a moment ago from the beginning of Matthew chapter 5, that Jesus begins his maybe most comprehensive teaching, his signature teaching in the Sermon on the Mount, begins that with 8 or 9 statements about who is truly blessed or happy. And they aren't at all the kinds of people or conditions we would normally associate with happiness. Blessed are those who mourn. Happy are you when you are persecuted and reviled. That doesn't immediately compute for most listeners. Yet they reveal a life within, a light within, that comes only from true proximity to God. The response when finding oneself mourning or reviled or put upon for Christ's sake, as Jesus says there in verse 12, is to rejoice and be exceedingly glad. This is the way of the kingdom. And it is the way, Acts 21 will show us, with one of the great proclaimers of the kingdom, in the Apostle Paul. I want to make our way through those last several verses there in Acts 21, roughly verse 15 through 36. And I think we'll find in that material a man who is living out those Beatitudes, who is finding himself blessed in unusual or unexpected circumstances. Jesus tells us in Matthew 5, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. And when I think of the Apostle Paul, I immediately really have in mind and focus on the idea of that hungering and thirsting. We realize in Acts 21 that we've made it here as the end result of a long and difficult process. Paul became a Christian some 20 years ago by this point in Luke's narrative. He's filled the intervening time, he's filled those 2 decades with constant travel and risk and self-sacrifice and pain. And we get the glimpse of that why in verse 19, where when Paul has greeted the elders in Jerusalem, James and the other elders of that church in Jerusalem, we see his immediate purpose in coming, the thing that most concerns him, the thing that is always closest to the front of his mind. When he greeted them, he immediately told in detail those things which God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. Why has Paul done what he has done for the last 20 years? To be God's instrument to do wonderful things among the Gentiles. It had consumed him for 2 decades of life, wherein everything had been about the mission. He's not a sightseer. He doesn't like filling up his passport. He doesn't like coming back and showing everybody cool pictures. He's not out there to have some fun life experiences and go on an adventure. When he's in Ephesus, he's fighting with wild beasts, he says. When he's going through the cities of Galatia, through Lystra and Derbe and Iconium and all those different places, he's being stoned halfway to death and left for dead on the side of the road. He's being chased from one place to another. He's being put in peril. He's being put in difficult straits. Why? Because there is a craving within him, a thirst and a hunger for righteousness. There may be some similarity here with another beatitude. I'm not going to give it its own entry, but I think it is similar. The idea of being poor in spirit. Jesus says, the blessed man is poor in spirit. That poverty, the word choice there in Matthew 5, literally describes a posture of crouching or cringing. To be poor in spirit isn't just kind of to have empty pockets, but it is the posture of a beggar. It is someone who crouches or cringes before another, because it is a heightened awareness of one's own weakness and one's total lack of the resources needed. The truly, abjectly, hopelessly poor will beg for what they need because they can't secure it themselves. They have nothing, and their poverty, not only of circumstance, but of spirit, their humility, their lowliness, and acknowledgement of lowliness, puts them in the begging posture. I need this to live. I can't do it myself. Will you please give it to me? The spiritually poor realize that need that our souls have and throw themselves at the Lord's feet with the same abandon, the same humility, but also with the same zeal, recognizing that if I don't get it from him, I won't get it from anywhere, and I won't have anything. We look at the example of Paul, and I realize he is not our final example. Paul himself says, imitate me as I imitate Christ. That's the figure. That's what we try to ultimately emulate. Paul himself is not our Messiah. And Paul is called specifically to do the things that he did. When he first became a Christian, the Lord marked him out for this particular brand of service. It wouldn't be accurate to say that if you're falling short of his level of activity, then you aren't living the life God envisions for you. We'll all serve as we are called and as we are equipped. But the drive behind it all can be the same. And Paul was driven, this hunger, this thirst. He counted himself to have nothing else but what God could provide. That he was impoverished, that he was in need. He was hungry, he was thirsty. He had a void that could only be resolved by God and his righteousness. Ask yourself, all of us, ask ourselves this morning, do we have that same hunger and thirst motivating us, motivating our lives, motivating our service? I oftentimes feel in my own life, pretty satisfied. That feeling you get when you've maybe ordered too much at the restaurant, or you've brought seconds along and you're sitting there at the table feeling like, well done. I made a pretty good showing of this today. I don't think anyone could fault me for my appetite today. And you feel sated. Is that when you go out and run a mile? Is that when you go out and think, okay, time to do the hardest work I'm going to do today, now that I want to just roll into the living room and get on the couch? That oftentimes is the sort of post-gorging sluggishness that we feel in our spiritual lives, where I don't really need anything. I don't really have a burning desire for righteousness, for doing the things of God. I'll get to it if I get to it. More would be nice, but I'm not hungry. I'm not thirsty. I'm filled. I'm satisfied. I'm content. What we see from Paul and from the Lord's most effective servants is in that way a discontent, a longing that will be satisfied only by maximum effort in the kingdom of God. Can we find that in our lives? Can we practice it in our lives? Well, as we move on a little bit further to see where Paul is ultimately going to go in Jerusalem, he doesn't just meet with these elders and tell them about what he has been up to. They have some information to pass on to him. They hear this and they say, yes, this is great. The work you've been doing chiefly among the Gentiles is wonderful. But then they begin telling him in verse 20 of what's been happening here in Jerusalem and Judea. And they've been making disciples as well, but from among the Jews, including those who they say in verse 20, at the end of verse 20, are all zealous for the law. And this zeal manifests itself in varying ways. And some of them have heard rumor of Paul. The things that are attributed to him in verse 21 are already disproven by what Luke has shown us in the narrative before. Paul has not taught the things he's being accused of teaching. He's not done the things he's being accused of doing. But essentially, he's being accused of a disregard, or really an animosity towards the law of Moses, towards Judaism, towards the things that their forefathers had practiced. And so the elders advise him, put them at ease. They've heard some scary things about you. Put their minds at ease. Take these men that we have, these 4 men who are going to perform a vow, a rite at the temple, pay for their costs there, go with them to do that, sort of sponsor them in this vow. They will see you at the temple. They'll see you doing things that good law-observant Jews do, and this will put everyone's minds at ease. And Paul does so, without question, without complaint, without any hypothesizing or arguing. He just immediately goes to perform this ritual. Jesus tells us in the Beatitudes that the peacemaker is blessed. Now, this peace can refer to a couple of things, or in a couple of different directions. I think they're related, and I find them present both in Paul's life and the life of anyone who follows Christ and is fit for the kingdom. What is it to be a peacemaker? We think immediately of people who can mediate disputes. People who, quite literally, can go into a situation where it isn't there and make peace. You find it, you forge it, you put it together from pieces that have been broken, whatever, but you make peace, either as a third party or a more interested, direct participant in a matter that could be anything but peaceful. So I see 2 brethren squabbling, and I try to bring wisdom and bring calm to both so that they can be reconciled. Or you have offended me and wronged me, but my peacefulness demands forgiveness and mercy extended to you instead of grudge and vengeance. Or I have wronged you, and because I value peace, I seek you out to make amends, to apologize, to try to fix what has been broken. rather than denial and distancing and defensiveness when my own sin is brought to light. And this we see Paul doing. Again, I maybe project only myself onto the text. Can't you picture yourself rolling your eyes a little at the elder's request here? You have these Jewish converts zealous for the law, as we saw there in verse 20, which really is a phrase that probably conveys both the original or possible good intention, zeal, fine. But as Paul will also say of himself in his self-description later in his writings, I was zealous for the law, yet without knowledge. Zeal, no matter what the intention might be, there is the possibility that it can be carried too far into lands where it has no place. But these Jewish converts are upset at Paul. Why? Because they believe every story about him, even if it's at odds with reality and truth. Because their consciences are so unbelievably sensitive. Because they cling to old ways that they really don't need to cling to anymore. Why am I mollifying these people again? Why am I making sure that they have everything just so? Because from a rightness perspective, Paul has done nothing wrong. But peacemakers. I'll take you 4 Jews to the temple. I'll go through your 7 days of purification. I'll pay for your offering. I'll make a visible public showing of attention to and respect for the things you hold dear, even if they're no longer legally binding. Paul shows no sign, no hint of sullenness or hesitance or irritation. It sounds like a good idea to him. Why? He desires peace. Even more important for the real peacemaker, though, is ultimate peace, which is found only in reconciliation of man with God. I want to have that for myself, and I want others to have it as well. And this is constantly revealed as the motive that Paul has. In the great passage that shows the underlying thought in times such as this, think of 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Paul writes not of this occasion in Jerusalem, but writes with insight and with thought process that feels like it must be governing what's going on in Acts 21. Though I'm free from all men, I've made myself a servant to all. I'm in 1 Corinthians 9, verse 19. That I might win the more. And to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might win Jews. To those who are under the law, as under the law, that I might win those who are under the law. To those who are without law, as without law. Not being without law toward God, but under law toward Christ. That I might win those who are without law. To the weak I became as weak, that I might win the weak. I've become all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. Now this I do for the gospel's sake, that I may be a partaker of it with you. Why does he do what he does? There he reveals it, that I might by all means save some. I do it for the sake of the gospel. I do it so that men can have peace with their God. In Ephesians 2, beginning in verse 17, he speaks there of Christ who came and preached peace both to you who are afar off, Gentile, and to those who are near, Jew. For through him we both have access by one Spirit to the Father. Jew, Gentile, one who makes vows and is circumcised and keeps the feast, and one who doesn't care a whit for all those things. It makes no difference. We're all in need of peace with God, salvation. And that's what Paul's entire life up to this point has been about, the last 2 decades of it at least. Bringing peace to men. Yes, with each other, but more importantly, with their Maker. Nothing can get in the way of that. No ritual, no observance, no thing that he needs to do to make someone happy, to set someone's conscience at ease. If it will save someone's soul, I'll do it. Again, I ask of myself, and I invite you to ask of yourself, is this part of our array of motives that we have in our lives? That the most important thing is that I have peace with God, that I'm right with him. And second, following closely behind that, are the other people that I can impact or exert any kind of influence over, are they in that state as well? Am I doing things to help them reach that point? Or does my behavior toward them drive them further away? Does it cause discord between me and them? Does it cause discord between them and others? Do I set a good example? Do I set the right tone? Do I bring peace into the world? The passage continues, and we see what happens when Paul goes through with the elder's idea. He goes to the temple. They're ready to make the offering. And yet Paul is spotted there by some Jews from Asia, Luke tells us, not locals, travelers who have come from Asia. And they see Paul, and they've heard all about Paul, and they know who Paul is, and they know the awful kinds of things that Paul has been up to, and all of the stink of Gentilism that he has all over him. And they've spotted him out on the town, by the way, with Ephesians, Gentiles, like Trophimus. And they see Paul with some other folks in the temple and immediately assume, incorrectly, he has brought into the inner court, beyond the wall of the court of the Gentiles, he has brought uncircumcised heathen into our holy places. He has defiled the temple. This man who teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law in this place now has committed the greatest sin of all by defiling the temple itself with his company. Again, not a bit of truth to their accusations, and yet there they are. But this passage and the subsequent mob and arrest and everything attending it continues the similarities that Luke has been making between Paul and Jesus. He's shown some very similar beats. You have the farewell address to beloved friends for their absence, preparing them for their absence. A foreboding journey to Jerusalem with 3 different proclamations about the fate that awaits them at the end. Jesus does that. Paul does that. You have an unlawful and dishonest arrest. It happens to Jesus. It happens to Paul. You have an exchange into Roman custody after the Jews have seized them, where the Romans find no fault in them. It happens to Jesus. It happens to Paul. You have an unruly mob intent on blood and violence crying out with the same language, the same words, "Away with him!" It happened to Jesus. It happens to Paul. But why is it happening? We've mentioned Paul's motives, his ultimate drive in the mission he was called to, and his personal desire to bring peace to men. Paul is no victim of circumstance here in Acts 21. He certainly isn't taken by surprise. How foolish would he have to be after having been warned by prophets for the entire journey to Jerusalem? If you go to Jerusalem, chains and imprisonment are awaiting you. The prophet Agabus even takes his belt and ties them around his hands and says the man whose belt this is going to be bound, and this way he's going to be tied up when he gets to Jerusalem. And now Paul gets to Jerusalem and goes to the place where many of his greatest enemies frequent. And, oh no, what's happening? I'm being arrested? I can't believe it. No, he's seen this coming a mile away. It's been telegraphed. It's a risky move. We'd have to call it a predictable end after everything that's built up to it. Paul is willing to be persecuted, to have, as Jesus says, all kinds of evil said against him falsely, to be reviled. Why? Just as Jesus tells us in the Beatitudes, for my name's sake, for righteousness' sake, for me. Let me mention here as well from a passage we quoted earlier, what Paul wrote to the Philippians, chapter 1 and verse 12, where he said, "These things have actually turned out to work a good end." The language there implies what I think must be the case during this ordeal, which is that Paul isn't certain of the how. Because he's writing to those Philippians much later to say, these things have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel. They've actually turned out for good. But that doesn't make sense, I don't think. When you're there in the portico of the temple, and you first hear the cry go up, "There he is! Get him!" And you're first accosted by rough hands, and you're first thrown to the ground and are receiving the first blows on the back of the head and the first kicks in the ribs, and you're seeing all that swirling demonic violence around you, I don't know that immediately in that moment you know, yes, but it'll work out for good. How? Why? Why will it benefit anyone for me to be arrested? What good will come from me rotting in a prison cell, which is a nice way of putting it, a hole in the ground, a dark hole where they're going to throw me? What good is going to come from me being shipped around the Mediterranean for various hearings and trials? God clearly knew he was going to be arrested in this way and didn't send an angel to bust him out of prison. Why? What's the end game here? There's no indication that Paul knows what for at this point. He merely knows that his suffering is for the Lord's sake. He's been called to endure and to do so in a certain way with patience and with faith. That's the part allotted to him in the moment. You do this because I've put it in front of you. You do this because it's happening to you because you've borne my name to the nations. The clarity of why or how or to what extent or to what benefit will come later. But that is what identifying with Jesus entails. A submission to whatever outcome might be demanded by our identifying with Jesus. Blessed are you when you bear these things, when you hear these things, when you suffer these things for my sake, Jesus says. We must recognize that if we live for his sake, live for him, this might be the outcome. And if it is, the Lord would tell us, rejoice and be exceedingly glad. Now that is a puzzle for another time, for another discussion. How do I have that mindset? How do I convince myself that that should be and must be my response? Again, just as Paul suffered maybe without knowing fully what would happen, what would come from it, sometimes we too will be thrown into the circumstance where we see only the challenge and only the difficulty in front of us, and it is left till later, it is left to the Lord's time to reveal why and to what good and for what benefit. But I call upon all of us to attempt a life that is blessed, that is not happy because of the things that we normally associate happiness with. Fun adventures with friends, a day on a jet ski, lots of money to roll around on top of, lots of vacation days, your favorite meal, your favorite slippers, a nice afternoon nap. Maybe I'm getting warmer with some of those as we get closer to noon. All the things that the world says, this will make you happy. This brand of soft drink, this whatever it is, this is where happiness is. Jesus tells us what a blessed life is. Poverty of spirit, hungering and thirsting and desiring with all that we have his righteousness, making peace with ourselves, between ourselves, with each other, and with him, meekness and mercy, and a willingness to endure anything if it happens because we believe in him and follow him. This morning, we make an offer to all who would hear it, to come to the Lord in faith, in that reliance upon him that we are talking about. Recognize your absolute need before him. We cannot save ourselves. We cannot forgive our own sin. We cannot secure our perfection. We cannot make ourselves holy once we have been defiled. We need God for that. We need Christ for that. We need his sacrifice. Today, if you would make good on it, believe and obey. Have faith in Christ. Express that loyalty, that devotion by repenting of sin, being baptized into Christ, receiving remission for all ills that you have done against him and against any other. This morning, if we can help you in obeying the gospel, we'd love to do that.